Good afternoon. Today we have a very special guest at our Rondelli Foundation. We have a visitor from the Helsinki Center of Excellence on Hybrid Threats, Mr. Paul Dickson, who is the Deputy Director for Research and Analysis at the Center. It's probably the best time to talk about the hybrid threats, having in mind the developments in Ukraine and having in mind the threats and the challenges we are facing here in Georgia. Hybrid threats. Mr. Paul Dickson is Canadian and works for the Center of Excellence in Helsinki, and I want to welcome him and to express my gratitude for this interview. Welcome to Rondelli Foundation. First, let me start with the purpose of your visit. As far as I know, this is the regional visit, and what is the purpose of your visit to Georgia?
Okay. Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to meet with you and to discuss this issue. The main purpose is to the inaugural trip, fact-finding mission, to understand the regional hybrid threat environment. So we're trying to identify regional actors who could be considered hybrid threats, the form in which hybrid threats are manifesting in the region, but also in the countries of the region. We're looking at vulnerabilities in the region and also what resilience looks like in the region. And to do that, we're building it in two ways, to look at a state-by-state level.
When you say region, you mean South Caucasus?
Well, yes, that actually it's a good question. We framed this under the guise of the Eastern Partnership countries. Okay. So we're using that as our regional lens or our framing device for this particular study. And we found in the past we've started using the regional lens for other studies like Middle East, North Africa, Arctic. It helps us to understand not only threats at a state level or to the state and emanating from the state at times, but also how regional dynamics can create new vulnerabilities. So interstate relations, interstate challenges, as well as just the dynamics of a particular region. And in this case, the framing of the Eastern Partnerships, how that may be used by an adversary to create tensions in and of itself. So the purpose is to explore on those two levels to try to get to obtain a better picture on the state level and in the regional level, but also to look for patterns, for trends, to look for similarities, to look for differences, and to help us understand then at the next stage after identifying the threats, identifying trends and patterns, to extrapolate that into potentially emerging threats, things that we're not necessarily paying much attention to or actors we're not paying much attention to, but that perhaps a state or region or several states should be looking at, or that the EU and NATO should be looking at, or member states on behalf of the region. I think as well after that we would like to look at the response, so resilience measures, how to counter the hybrid threats that we've identified. So that's the primary trajectory of the project so far.
That was my next question, and I think probably it's too early to ask for your evaluations, conclusions, and recommendations. But during your visit, learning, meeting the officials, meeting the civil society representatives, what is your very first conclusion? What are the major threats to hybrid threats to Georgia, and what should Georgian society and the Georgian government do to resist to those threats successfully?
Well, these would be, as you suggested, very preliminary observations on my part. But based on, we've been very fortunate to have a wide range of views, perspectives from civil society, from the state itself, as well as experts like yourself in the context of the foundation. So It's been quite illuminating for us, and we were also having come from Armenia, some sense of already starting to have some comparative basis to a degree. But at this point, I think the major conclusions or observations would be the state actor to be most concerned about clearly is Russia. And if we didn't consider that based on the evidence, the last few days would I think would have forced that conclusion. But from a vulnerabilities perspective, I think the political and societal divisions seem to be creating vulnerabilities and opportunities for a state actor like Russia to amplify this through disinformation, through promotion of their model. There could be some suggestions that the authoritarian model that they are offering, in a sense, or at least suggesting as an alternative to the Western model of rule of law and individual rights, is not only preferable, but is successful. And I think that's another element we've noticed, that the EU-NATO preferences of the population, as I've understood them so far, seem to be heavily disputed by the Russian disinformation campaign. I think the environment for disinformation seems to be quite vulnerable. The divisions are amplified in a number of ways. Some of that seems to be as a result of the dependency on TV and as a result of language. So the mediums are also amplifying, a multiplying factor in this, I think, in this environment. It's been mentioned the language minorities are particularly vulnerable to this because of the lack of access to Georgian or Georgian-sponsored Russian language TV. So via cable or Russian channels themselves, they seem to have a readily available means of promoting their ideas and disinformation. I think another major feature related to Russia, but also to the evolution of the country over the last decade or so, is the dependencies, like energy dependency, infrastructure dependency, the proximity of the highway to major arteries to the occupied territories, the resource based economy makes it dependable. Wheat was stated as one particular dependency on the imports of wheat from Russia, so it creates a great potential for economic coercion. Similarly, obviously, not only the occupation that has occurred since 2008, but also their attempt to instrumentalize the border as a weapon in and of itself. So we've heard different figures for how much of the border has been fenced, but it also seems evident that the fencing itself, the borderization, is being conducted in such a way that it allows them to exert maximum pressure, allows them to an opportunity to provoke at a time of their choosing, so they can use it to obtain a strategic effect. So, which is something that came through from a number of discussions. I think our discussions with the state representatives also suggest perhaps a bit of a disconnect in the discourse between public opinion and the state, but I wouldn't want to say that's a conclusion.
Okay.
We're very preliminary stages of what we're looking at.
So we're doing this interview in the darkest hours in Ukraine. We see it. We are following the developments, the aggression, unjustified, unprovoked aggression, attack from Russian Federation on Ukraine.
It's a horrible time.
We are watching on TV and social media, tanks, fighter jets, artillery, moving in, attacking the Russian troops, Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian civil buildings and the hospitals, the kindergartens, and etc. This is one part of the attack of Russia on Ukraine. But how big is the role of the hybrid in itself means the combination of the military and informational warfare conducted against this or that country, in this particular case against Ukraine. How big is the role of the informational warfare conducted by Russian Federation against Ukraine?
Well, I think I would answer that by looking at two angles, because I think what may be occurring for people who work in the examining hybrid threats is that it's unclear at times whether a hybrid campaign using disinformation, pretexts, attempts to undermine faith in state institutions, hollowing out of the state from within, creating divisions, amplifying divisions, is a pretext, a priming of the state for a kinetic invasion, or whether it is sufficient in and of itself. And I think it's not entirely clear that the signals and indicators would allow us to understand a direction. So the relative role of that prior to the kinetic invasion, certainly there was not insignificant literature suggesting Ukraine the government could be toppled without firing a shot. They had undermined their economy through their military force posture. That the threat of invasion was sufficient to start to create challenges for the economy, limited access through flights, increasing costs for insurance, and in some cases, many companies not willing to go there because of the costs. The cyber attacks were accelerating and targeting, I think, much more clearly. Again, in retrospect, a prelude, but at the time, unclear whether it was in isolation or just part of a broader campaign to just undermine the government and the state in and of itself. The diplomatic coercion, the false flag operations, things that the Russians were engineering that they would then blame on the Ukrainians as a pretext to create a
How would you evaluate? Did it work, these false flag operations?
Well, I think what it seems to, based on, and I have not seen the figures, but I mean, there seems to be some segment of the Russian population, at least, that believed it and felt that, at least prior to the invasion, that there was justification for protecting Russian citizens in that region. I think from a Western perspective, there's not many that would, I think, believe those anymore. And in fact, I think one of the more sophisticated approaches was the one that was being taken by the US, the UK, some of the Western powers, to try to call these out beforehand, so to undermine their credibility before the actual pretext took place, or before the action took place. But certainly, it's not. I think that the challenge here now is to understand who the target of those is, because in convincing external opinion outside of Russia, I don't think it's particularly compelling or convincing. Internally, this is very preliminary, but I've seen some indication that if there had not been an invasion, this was seen as a successful attempt for Putin to maneuver himself to protect Russian minorities, but that opinion did not in Russia did not necessarily believe that an invasion was imminent. So I say that based on very limited sources, but I mean, to me it's unclear exactly whether you could state this was successful even in Russia, given the events. But so I think it's early days. Yeah,
and my last question would be that we in Georgia, our Ukrainian friends, in Moldova, we are all facing this informational warfare and hybrid threats against our countries.
Yes.
But we know that this is similarly considered as a threat for the European Union and NATO member countries. How seriously the hybrid threats affect the public opinion in the EU and NATO member, and what are the tools which are used by, I believe, mostly by the Russian Federation in the European Union and NATO member states to affect the public opinion and in this way to interfere into the internal affairs of EU and NATO member states?
On the first question, I mean, there is a broad recognition, certainly among the policymakers, I think, or at least among defense and security personnel doing security. I think there's still an educational requirement to not only on the nature of the threats, but what are hybrid threats. It's a term that I think many would recognize, but few could define or understand specifically. Among the general populace, I think the distinction between a hybrid threat that is something occurring outside of a conflict or even creating a state of persistent confrontation without actually going over the threshold towards a declared war, or as we understand the term, is not well known. I think in certain parts of hybrid warfare are becoming better understood. Disinformation, for example, and the pandemic probably was a catalyst for that. Between the misinformation and the disinformation, I think there was a much different public debate about the need to address these things, to get the truth out there, and in that sense created a tool for addressing disinformation, put the truth out. Don't necessarily address every single piece of disinformation, but say your story. Don't react to the disinformation narratives, or create your I won't call it narrative, but ensure your understanding of the issue. In the case of the pandemics, here are the facts with the vaccines. Here's vaccine efficacy. Here are the vaccine tests to show its credibility, et cetera, et cetera. So to combat it with the truth. I think in terms of the actual threats, it varies very much by state. I mean, the existence of the hybrid COE, the Center of Excellence, is kind of a testament to, or is a testament to, the degree of awareness at the government level of the nature and the consequences of the threats, and how the aggregate of a lot of these activities can have a very serious consequence for the states as a serious security risk. But state by state, they differ. So, in particular, geography still matters. I mean, proximity to the threat actor is correlated to the degree to which they can not only affect, but marry their hybrid activities to the very real threat of conventional warfare. So I mean, I don't think the two can be divorced, that the consequences or the effectiveness of hybrid activities in a lot of cases is directly related to the underlying threat of force that is a large consequence of a broader spectrum of soft and hard power tools, the marrying of the two. I think the disinformation is one area where there's probably better known among the public, and certainly among policymakers, among government, but cyber security and cyber threats similarly. What's changing there is probably the expansion, the range of targets, which many in the West are still unaware. Cybersecurity awareness is not as probably high as many would like. And again, the pandemic was, I think, important here, where targets that are not normally, or institutions and domains that were not normally targeted, like healthcare sectors, academic research, that were suddenly working on very critical things like vaccine development, became targets of cyber attacks, malware, ransomware. So those things also elevated the profile and the discussion of cybersecurity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wish you success in your explorations, and then hope to hear from you more details about your conclusions and even more important, your recommendations how to counter the disinformation and the hybrid threats in Georgia and in our friendly countries. And thank you once again for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your cooperation as well.
Thank you.
And your insights, and I hope we will be able to contribute to the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Going forward.
Thank you.